Welcome to Mr. Rodman's Top 12 Highlights. We're going to look at Chapter 12 in the executive branch, the roles, the responsibilities of the presidency. Thanks for joining me. All right, let's look at number one, the executive branch. Let's look at kind of the details here. In terms of qualifications, you've got to be 35 years of age, a natural-born citizen, and again, that hasn't clearly been defined by the courts in terms of its interpretation, and a resident of the United States for 14 years. The idea here, not someone who's from another country, comes over and then decides to run for president. The 12th Amendment actually split the votes for president and vice president up to that point, up to the election of 1796. It basically was confusing for the Electoral College because people were voting, but there was no clear delineation about whether you're voting for president or vice president, and thus the difficulty of that led to throwing the election into the House of Representatives, which then went for John Adams as opposed to Thomas Jefferson. So there was confusion in that regard. But the 12th Amendment cleared that up, splitting the votes, basically putting them on a ticket and having them run for president and vice president in the Electoral College. The 22nd Amendment actually limits the president to 2 full terms. This happened after FDR won 4 elections for president. The Republicans in charge at the time, trying to limit that, and later on many of them said the Republicans of the 1980s wish they hadn't done that so that Reagan could have run again because he was so popular across the board. The 25th Amendment called for the presidential succession. This basically looks at the idea of if a president is incapacitated or cannot serve because of a disability, there is a line of succession. This brought about by the Cold War, when with the Soviet Union at the time, and the concerns that that if there was a nuclear fallout or a nuclear bomb that hit and took out many of the leadership in Washington, D.C., what would happen? Who would pick up the pieces and begin the new government? And this basically created a very long line of succession for members of the cabinet and members of Congress in terms of that role. And that goes down to each of the cabinet member levels. We start with obviously the president, then the vice president, then the Speaker of the House, then the Senate President pro tempore in the Senate, and then we move from there to cabinet positions. So that was basically brought about because of the Cold War and really helped to define what the presidential succession would be in the event of a catastrophic disaster. Articles of impeachment. Remember, you need to be specific here in that the House of Representatives impeaches a president. They bring up a president on charges, or a federal judge for that matter, or a vice president. In this case, we always hear about it if it's a president, because we've had 2 of them that have been impeached. The Senate actually holds the trial on the impeachment charges, on the Articles of Impeachment. So impeachment means not to be removed from office, but simply to be brought up on charges that will then be heard in the Senate. Now, keep in mind, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were the only 2 that were impeached by the House of Representatives, neither of them convicted in the Senate. Richard Nixon was never impeached. He resigned before the Articles of Impeachment were voted on. And it's not the president that is usually targeted in this. It's usually the judges, the federal judges, and some of them have been removed in a trial that's held in the Senate. The courts only have one role in this process. The Senate holds the trial, the House brings up charges. The Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, actually presides over the trial, and that's the only role that the courts have in this check and balance of the executive branch and the judicial branch held by the legislative branch. In terms of formal roles of the president, we talked about these in class, and they are outlined in the Constitution. The 3 majors, that's commander-in-chief, what we call diplomat-in-chief, and the administrator-in-chief. The overseeing the armed forces is commander-in-chief, the diplomat-in-chief working with other nations, and the administrator-in-chief overseeing the 4+ million people that work within the bureaucracy and the executive branch all around the world. And keep in mind that most of those people aren't working in Washington, D.C. They're working in field offices that are located throughout the United States and in other countries. A signing statement is basically the president issuing an order, like an order, but they're basically signing a bill into law from the Congress, and they're basically making a statement about the bill. Either they really support it, or there are key pieces of it that they love and parts of it they don't, or they're talking about how they're going to sign the bill because of all the good things it can do, but there's a couple of things in here that they're not going to really carry out in terms of getting the bureaucracy to enforce. They're going to ignore. And that's the purpose of a signing statement. Remember, the president has a bully pulpit. They're going to use it in terms of the media and getting the media's attention. So a signing statement is a really great opportunity for them to use that platform, that media event, to basically focus on what they want to say about this bill, things that they love and obviously things that they don't. The War Powers Act of 1973, very controversial even to this day, a lot of it because it hasn't really been tested in the courts. But during the Vietnam era, the concern of the Congress was that the president was given too much power as commander-in-chief, and they wanted to try and rein that in. Now, they always had the power of the purse, so the War Powers Act of 1973 never really impacted that. They could always cut the budget or impact the budget to try and keep wars from starting or keep wars from continuing, but that has a big backlash when you send American troops into harm's way and then you cut their budget. That's never a good thing in terms of trying to win the support of the American people, many of which have members that are in the armed forces that are fighting in those wars. So that actually happened during Vietnam, and Congress cut the funding, and that was not a good thing. The backlash was pretty severe. So the president does need to consult Congress. It's basically saying that the president has 60 days and can get an additional 30 if they basically give Congress notification of what they're doing. But it is still in question as to whether that's actually constitutional or not. Now, executive agreements basically are like executive orders that are done on the domestic front, but they're dealing with foreign policy issues with other nations. This is a situation in which a president is trying to establish maybe more formal agreements, wants to get to a treaty, but doesn't have the support of the Senate, or they're in a trial stage trying to work it out with another country in terms of details that they would formalize later into a treaty, or let the next president worry about it, because basically an executive agreement doesn't extend beyond the president's term in office. So the idea there is that the president would have the executive agreement with another nation until they tried to formalize a treaty, which then would be ratified by the Senate, or their term of office expired, and so did the executive agreement. So this is common for the president to use with another nation, especially when they're trying to formalize new details for a treaty or they just can't quite get there yet. The bully pulpit, as I mentioned, is when the president uses the media in order to get a point across that they're trying to set. They're trying to focus on a particular piece of the policy agenda and really getting the people to pay attention to it. Remember, the president gets a lot of attention when they speak. People listen because the media is listening. 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate tend to get lost in the noise, but one president speaking in front of a pool of reporters tends to get a lot of attention. Executive privilege, and the president will use that, by the way, in all sorts of ways. We've seen that over the last 50, 60 years, definitely using the role of the media to shape their agenda and to shape what they want the media to focus on. Executive privilege is the idea that the president wants to have conversations with his most close confidants and advisors, and they're immune from being called by Congress through subpoena to testify. This again is also one of those gray areas in terms of the separation of powers. Congress needs to investigate, wants to call hearings, wants to make sure that the bureaucracy and the executive branch is checked on what roles they do and don't have, but they're also limited in that sometimes the president needs to be able to have candid conversations and honest and frank conversations with advisors and get their honest opinions on things that aren't necessarily going to be recalled by a member of Congress investigating them. So this is where some advisors have executive privilege in order to keep that privacy private, so that the president can have that that relationship with advisors, and they can be honest with him without having to worry about being called to testify on what they've said or not said to a president. So that's executive privilege. Impoundment of funds, again, coming after Vietnam, but also coming after Watergate and the concerns of presidents not wanting to spend the money that was budgeted. This is where we get the rescission, or the cancellation of the way the budget is supposed to be used. Congress makes the laws, including approving a budget. The president can propose one, but it isn't a formal power that the president has. They're allowing the president to weigh in on that in terms of proposing a budget because they're the head of the executive branch and the bureaucracy. But the idea is that the Congress approves the budget, and the president and the bureaucracy should spend the money the way they set out the budget to be handled. And if that isn't the case, then they should return the money, right? The idea of rescission. So impoundment of funds basically says, Mr. President, if you're not going to use the money that way, then give us the money back. Tell us you're going to not, you're not intending to spend that money, and then Congress would delete that funding. And that actually is a process through the Budget Reform Act of 1974 to impound those funds has actually been upheld by the courts through the separation of powers, Congress having the power to make the laws, including budgetary laws, and the courts have upheld that as siding with Congress on those particular issues. Now, who helps carry out or execute these laws? This is where we get down to the cabinet, the White House staff, the independent agencies, and the executive office of the president. The cabinet, pretty straightforward. These are the people that the president is relying on within the bureaucracy as the heads of the different agencies, the different departments, such as Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, or Department of Health and Human Services, and they are the secretaries, the heads of those agencies. The White House staff are the president's closest confidants. These are the people that, again, are in that executive privilege category. They fall under the closest relationships to the president. They're the senior advisors. They're the ones that are just down the hall and work with the president on a daily basis. In terms of the people that he sees most often. The independent agencies are the ones that have a little more leeway and a lot more wiggle room in terms of being able to carry out the mission, such as the National Science Foundation. They're focused on science issues. The president doesn't really have a lot of day-to-day. The president may call them in to talk about what the policy agenda is and how they fit into that, or how they don't, and then they're allowed to carry on and kind of go with what their mission is and what they're allowed to do. So they're very independent of the executive branch. Thus the Now, the executive office of the president includes people that work within different agencies within the old executive office building near the White House, but they don't see the president on a day-to-day basis, but they definitely see the president and his staff, the White House staff, more than the independent agencies would. These include groups like the Office of Management and Budget that are responsible for coming up with the president's budget, the Council of Economic Advisors that is basically tasked with how do we help the economy, how do we give the president advice on helping the economy and creating jobs and promoting business and fair trade. So that's more the executive office. So they are close to the White House staff, but the White House staff are the ones that primarily work in the West Wing. They're the ones that work in the actual White House itself. In terms of the executive office of the president, As I mentioned, CIA would fall into this category, the Council of Economic Advisors. Also OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, people who are responsible for the hiring and firing of those in the bureaucracy. And the trade representative, looking at, again, as I talked about, fair trade. So the White House staff are the ones that have the proximity. They're the ones with the real power because of the nearness that they have to the president. They're literally down the hall, probably see the president multiple times a day, and the president relies on them to be his closest confidants in terms of in terms of advice and guidance there, and the president's going to rely on them for a lot of information. They don't typically require Senate confirmation. All of those in the White House staff, the exception of that being the chief of staff. The cabinet I talked about in terms of the running the different departments within the bureaucracy, and such as the Secretary of State, which would run the State Department, and the many the diplomats and bureaucrats around the world that work for consulates and embassies for the United States around the globe. This is more of an outline of the executive branch and the roles the departments play here. And remember, the presidential appointments is where the president's going to appoint people. Some of those are Senate approved positions. Usually that's cabinet departments or the chief of staff, as I mentioned. But many of them aren't below the director level, aren't Senate approved and Senate confirmed positions. Federal judges also obviously are a part of that confirmation. And I created this map. It's actually a blog post I'm going to link on Google Classroom, showing you the differences between these four appointments. The cabinet departments we talked about, the secretaries of state, independent executive agencies like the National Science Foundation I mentioned, they kind of do their own thing. Regulatory commissions, again, following the policy agenda of the president, appointed by the president on different intervals, but they basically are regulating their area of industry. The FCC, for instance, regulating the Federal Communications Commission. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulating public companies and the disclosure of information in a timely manner to investors. And then we have government corporations like Amtrak and the Postal Service that basically are for-profit companies that usually aren't making a profit, but they do charge for their services, and we all pay for those services. And then lastly, let's talk about acting appointments versus recess appointments. An acting appointment is someone who's been appointed, but they've been appointed on an acting basis, meaning that once the president's term is over, or the Congress, the 2-year biennial Congress is over, then that appointment would end, whichever comes first. And a recess appointment is actually where the president appoints an official without Senate approval and bypasses basically their approval. Now Congress has kind of fought back on this by trying not to recess as often as possible in order to get around that. But that has been a common way for a president to appoint someone more controversial to an agency or to a department or to a court, though we haven't seen that as much lately. Most of the time it's been to a position within the cabinet or within a president's staff in order to bypass a Senate confirmation hearing that's pretty controversial and would take a lot of time and they probably wouldn't pass. The last thing I want to mention is presidential approval. Presidents are always looking at polls, whether they say they are or not. Many of them say they're not, but they are. And let's be real, the White House wants to keep their presidential approval high. The media talks all about it if the president's approval rating is very low or starts to slide. And this is what we see in terms of the president then choosing, well, what should be on my policy agenda in order to keep that presidential approval high. And they go back and forth on this all the time in terms of do we rally around the flag? Do we try and promote more patriotism in order to get more approval? What types of issues should we be focused on? Are these issues that the American public doesn't care about, and thus the approval is low because of it? These are the types of things that presidential advisors and the president and his staff talk about all the time. So what is the true test of presidential approval? And the answer to that is time. If we look at somebody like President Harry Truman, when he ran for re-election, he was beloved when he left office, he was not beloved. He was almost scorned. And today we look at him with a lot different viewpoint because of the tough decisions that he made at the time. So he has actually withstood the test of time, and actually his approvals has actually improved over time because of some of the tough decisions that he had to make. So these are the top 12 highlights from chapter 12. I hope you found them helpful. And again, go back to the chapter notes and these highlights on Google Classroom. And I wish you well on the upcoming quiz.